So welcome everyone again. Everyone looks familiar, so
yes, that's reassuring.
Nice to have you back. So the two persons still in the waiting room, but I'm not quite sure why can't I access them. Anyway, it'll all get resolved. So Javier, please go ahead. Nice to have you back with us, and looking forward to the session.
I look forward to it too. It's a very challenging topic. So I hope at least we managed to ask a few important questions together. And if possible, to clarify some of the connections that Krishnamurti makes between thought, time, the observer, and the observed. In many ways, this is what all the nucleus of what he had to say. When he talks with Bohm and so on, he's talking about thought and the ending of time. Now, that sounds a bit dramatic, sounds a bit apocalyptic, the ending of time, but he means actually something else, right? As we all are aware of by now, after having studied his work for a while. So we're going to deal today with that topic as best as we can. And that's just the fourth paragraph in his statement of the core of the teachings. So I read it. So we have it maybe present in our minds. Thought is time. So there we are already. Big question, is it? Thought is born of experience and knowledge, which are inseparable from time and the past. Time is a psychological enemy of man. Our action is based on knowledge and therefore time. So man is always a slave to the past. Thought is ever limited, and so we live in constant conflict and struggle. There is no psychological evolution. When man becomes aware of the movement of his own thoughts, he will see the division between the thinker and thought, the observer and the observed, the experiencer and the experience. He will discover that this division is an illusion. Then only is there pure observation, which is insight without any shadow of the past or of time. This timeless insight brings about a deep, radical mutation in the mind. This is his statement. He has basically two parts, one in which he just talks about thought and time, and the other about the observer and the observed, the thinker and the thought. And those are, of course, obviously connected, but it is important to see the connection, and we'll do our best. So the first thing is that thought is time. Now, if we look at our thoughts, is that obvious to us? I think every morning, every day, there's a stream of thinking. Am I aware of that being time? I'm aware of it being in time. But time as inbuilt in thought, is that something we can perceive? The logic of his statement is he explicates it later, right? In the next phrase, basically, in a couple of phrases later, which is that thought, basically his definition, as you remember, is that it's the response of memory. Now, memory is naturally of the past. So that's where he makes a connection. Where is time in thought? Not only this moment now, or that it is a movement, and therefore it can be, taken by the clock, can be measured by the clock. How long did I think? And so on, right? It's an action, it's a movement that goes on in the mind, the stream of consciousness, right? It's in time because we can measure how long it lasted. But it's actually based on time, is of the essence of it. That's where it goes, right? Where Krishnamurti finds the meaning of time in thought. And that is because it's based on memory. So I can only be aware of thought as time internally if I'm aware of the memory that is behind it. So that's the question for us. To what extent is there an awareness of that being the ground, the source of thought, that it is born of experience and knowledge, which are of the past, and therefore time-bound, right? It has a movement, it's happening now, but the root of it, the content of it, is yesterday, or a minute ago, is the past. Time is a psychological enemy of man. Wait, I'm not sure we can jump to that. He jumps, you see, he puts all kinds of phrases suddenly in the middle there. How did he jump from thought is born of experience to saying that it is an enemy? That's a major thing to say about time. But if time is an enemy, then we have it right in our home. We have it right in our heads. We are that. Therefore, we are our own enemies. I want to wait a little bit before we look into why thought is our enemy. It is our enemy in great part, just in principle. It will be our enemy if it goes against us, right? What is an enemy? It's somebody who's really in opposition to us and in fact has an intention of destroying us. So we have to see how thought is opposed to us, is in us, but is opposed to us, and how it is destructive. It undermines us, it destroys us. Is this a battle that we carry with ourselves internally? If we cultivate thought and time, we are, in principle, going against our own interests, undermining our wholeness, destroying ourselves. That would be a major indictment in terms of what this consciousness that we currently have is actually doing, right? How would mankind ever? Because we're all go there, right? Because we are all intending the good. We're all intending our security, our safety, our achievement, our health, some kind of well-being. And that we do through knowledge, in part through thought. Why has mankind cultivated knowledge? Because in there we find a measure of security. Knowledge scientifically gives us supposedly facts. And in those facts, on those facts that we can rely in terms of action, right? Otherwise, what would we do? If you look at the history of mankind, there is a sense in which we began with certain glimpses of causation, misattributions of causation, which is what you might call superstition, right? Is a sense of, if I sacrifice these enemies to the god, then to the sun, then the sun will keep rising. We have done all kinds of monstrous things on the basis of misunderstanding of causation, right? The magical thinking, religious thinking, scientific thinking. So science came partly as an answer, as an attempted answer to dissolve the misunderstandings concerning the nature of causation in the natural world, but also in our own actions, right? What leads to what? But we have to establish the facts before we can act correctly. So that has been a great enterprise, the part of the great enterprise of knowledge. So people like Brunowski and so on, scientists became quite excited about it, thinking that there is an ascent of man, that mankind really rises above itself, is sort of going towards a kind of perfection by the development of further and more accurate, deeper and subtler levels of knowledge. Now, Krishnamurti, in principle, doesn't object to scientific knowledge used properly, because it's also misused, right? But there's a domain of knowledge, which he calls knowledge also. See, this is where it can get a little confusing in his language, because he uses knowledge both for the objective scientific information about things, as well as for our own notions of ourselves, for the memories on which we base our own self-image, our identifications. That being a Christian, or thinking that one is a Christian, and being identified with that tradition, with that stream of memory, of experience, of ideas, beliefs, and the rest, that is not of the same order as knowing something about Newtonian mechanics, or quantum mechanics, or relativity, or technology, and so on. It is not the same level. Why not? That's part of it, is distinction between psychological and objective knowledge. So he does accept knowledge at a certain level, the scientific, technological. He says there it is important, there it is necessary, there must be skill in thought. So thought is not to be rejected per se, because without it, we couldn't really exist, at least as we have developed, right? If we look into our own rooms, we see how much thought has done. It's all been put together by thought. The technological thing is based on knowledge, technique, and that took generations to come to this point. So it's a cumulative process of time. Without it, we couldn't do what we do. We couldn't even speak these languages, this language. This is time, it is memory, it is knowledge, and that is part of the necessary instruments that we have to live, to survive, to handle reality and survive. But, so that's not the enemy. That knowledge is not an enemy, except when the enemy uses it. So we see, when, like in war, right? They use very good knowledge, very good technology. We use it to destroy each other, right? This is going on in Ukraine, right? Now, the English have passed, these Europeans, the Westerners have passed very good technology to Ukrainians. And that's part of what is allowing them to, repel the Russian invasion at the moment. So that's part of it, technology used for these causes of war. War, is it part of knowledge? Or is part of the enmity that knowledge introduces into human relationships? That is, introduces identity, separation, division, and is therefore a factor of conflict. So that kind of knowledge is not the same. And yet, this is the danger. It uses technological knowledge in order to destroy each other. This is where Krishnamurti says, well, look, careful here. The psychological invariably overcomes the physical, the technological. The inner invariably overcomes the outer. If human thinking in terms of identity, perspective of oneself and on others is divisive, then we will use the most objective kind of knowledge still for a wrong purpose. It will be a tool of violence. And that's what we have done. And that's what we continue to do. Krishnamurti is seeing a tremendous danger in this structure, whereby the psyche naturally controls knowledge, scientific knowledge, on the basis of an illusion. And that's why that's why we have to look at it carefully to see whether we can even appreciate the illusory nature of this inner so-called knowledge. Because you see, the word is the same, but they don't mean the same thing. Inner psychological knowledge or objective knowledge. They only mean the same in as much as they are memory. But one is factual and the other is fundamentally illusory. That these identifications of country, nation, race, religion, ideology are essentially illusory. Is that so? We're all leaning on that, you see, to give us a sense of being. I am. Now he's saying that I am, that puts all these things after it. I put those things after my name. Those things are false. The notion of a self is false. We're not going to accept anything. This is subtle. And we have to also understand what we understand and don't understand. His point, bringing it to that level of subtlety. Is there at all a role in the psyche or of knowledge, psychological knowledge in our lives? Is that drastic? Do you, even any notion of yourself is a dangerous thing? Is it? So, okay, I'm holding my horses there. So the idea that knowledge is an enemy has to do with that conception, that perception, that understanding. It would only be dangerous if it divides, creates conflict. In part, we've already had a warning of this in earlier chapter when we discuss the content of consciousness, of all those images that humanity creates in order to build fences of security for itself, political, religious, personal, and so on. So we saw there that the image does divide. The identification where we seek security ends up dividing and therefore undermining security, which puts mankind in a total contradiction with itself. That's not security when it divides and creates conflict, right? And he's bringing it again now to the field of thought and time, which is fundamentally that whole same field of image making, right? So we'll look at it a little bit further. Our action is based on knowledge and therefore time. So action is also the same. If my experience, my knowledge informs my thinking, it also informs my action. So he takes issue with that as well, right? If the action comes from thought, he says, is it action? He nonetheless, look, there's a kind of subtlety here, which sometimes I find difficult to navigate. And first he says, thought is necessary for action, because in the practical world, right, if I want to go from here to Amsterdam, I have to know what direction to take, right? And so on, and which road to take. I have a device in my car that tells me, so I just follow that, right? So turn right in 100 meters. So okay, I turn right in 100 meters. But knowledge has to be there. This is also knowledge from this machine. I have a purpose, I have a place to go to, and there I go. This is action based on knowledge, right? But in relationship, that's where the problem partly lies. He says, in relationship, action based on knowledge in my memory of another is divisive. There is no seeing of the actuality. That's where the image becomes dangerous. And therefore, since it comes from the past, this is part of the issue. Since it comes from the past, is it really action? Because it is what has already been. The action requires, what does action require? That I see something that is actually there, that I meet the challenge. And this is part of the issue that Krishnamurti takes with all knowledge, really, right? Which is that the response from knowledge has inbuilt the past in it. And the past can only recognize what is there. But the challenge now, the present, doesn't reproduce the past exactly. Life keeps moving. It presents us with something new. In fact, for Kay, that newness of life is truth. So if we're continuously repeating the process of the past, then that truth is missed. The new, which is unknown, is missed because the knowledge keeps absorbing whatever is happening now into its own preconceived structures, previous structures. So the action from the past, what I'm responding to, is not what is right there, but what I have already understood from before. The likelihood of my missing the actuality is therefore increased. And that's what he just assumes. I'm not sure that that's always the case, because there are features in life that do repeat. That's how knowledge finds its meaning, right? It's relevant because there are features of life that do repeat, that do recur, right? We have things that are constants. They are constants in life, in nature, and so on. So that's where knowledge has a function, because then the recognition is accurate, because reality is repeating that same feature to which knowledge applies. But as we in relationship, that reduces it to a mechanical thing, right? There's a repetition involved. That's relationship repeat. Are our relationships also to be reduced to that same structure? Do we repeat ourselves? We do in certain regards, but maybe we do also because we are fixed in the past. But if we are alive, we know that no day is the same. No instant is repeating. There is always something new happening. And are we alive, therefore, to that very creative dynamic of life itself? This is what Kay is calling for, that if we are to be alive and not a repeating machine, not enclosed in some past, not to be the past, and therefore dead to life in its fullness, we have to be aware of the present, and the past has to be suspended to that degree to permit the perception of what is happening. The past cannot do it. The past can only recognize. So it has to be suspended. You see, that's part of also the enemy. The enemy is reducing our lives to a little pre-existing scheme of things and preventing the whole perception of things, therefore the whole blooming of ourselves, right, of our being, to time. Are we time? Or there is being beyond time, of which we are? Right? That's part of it. So knowledge, and he says we're always a slave to the past. We're a slave to the past if this machine keeps going, right? Bound to it, continuously caught in the treadmill of that repeating pattern, which he describes sometimes, of knowledge, experience, thought, action, experience, knowledge, thought, action, experience. So it goes like a little, treadmill. It keeps treading, changes a little, of course, naturally. It's not completely dead. There's shifting in knowledge and so on. But the very fact that the past is what predominates is what gives it its static nature, makes it static. And I don't know if you haven't had that experience in your own lives of coming upon this feeling of the psyche being extremely repetitive. That one's own consciousness has fallen into that very mechanical pattern. That me is just a series of repeating patterns which I actually recognize as me. Would there be a me without that repeating series of patterns and without the recognition of the patterns as being me? Interesting, see? Without that mechanicalness, maybe the me also is not there. Not at least at this level of the repeating structure of consciousness that identifies that, a habit. I think it was the American psychologist, William James, who said, by the age of 30, we all become a bundle of habits. I'm not sure that there's not quite some truth in that. You see, one has observed oneself to see how repetitive consciousness can become. And that's shocking. That was shocking to me because of the feeling that, one has the feeling that one is alive and has a certain quality of intelligence and sensitivity and feeling and artistic sensibility. Yes, all that is there. And yet psychologically, there is this machine going on. We fall into a habit. And in fact, the self, the identity, seems to be determined to continue precisely in those patterns that it has already set for itself. That's conditioning, right? So we are conditioned, and conditioning is the mechanical. So thought is ever limited, he says, for this reason that is based on the past and therefore is anchored in that time. He used to say, thought is like a donkey tied to a tether. Right? The tether is what it knows, and therefore it can only move within the radius of that knowledge. But that radius is always small. I think we see it in daily life, right? We have a certain knowledge, and that allows us a certain range of perception, a certain range of action. But you can see the edges of that, that there's always something beyond. It doesn't cover everything. Thought is invariably limited. Every memory is limited. And Kay used to say things like, there's no complete knowledge of anything. So knowledge comes with its own incompleteness necessarily. Even in our experience of anything, what we remember is how we remembered it, which had to do with the kind of fixation of already viewpoints that we brought to bear on the experience. So the memory itself is already partial. I remember going to an exhibition of paintings by Magritte, one of my favorite painters, the Belgian painter Magritte. And he had a curious painting on the wall. And there's a major retrospective exhibition in London at the National Gallery. No, the Hayward Gallery. And it was a painting. He has these paradoxes in his work, right? But he had a painting of a still life, which was of a bowl of fruit on a table with a jar of water and with a certain background of cupboards and things. But he painted it as though the whole of that still life was carved out of basalt. That's volcanic rock. Basalt, volcanic rock, it has a lot of holes in it because of the air bubbles. And he entitled it Souvenir de Voyage, a souvenir of a trip. What you remember is not the complete picture. It's full of holes, right? So I thought, wow, what a way to illustrate such a perception. So I found it funny, and of course he had that sense as well. I do remember the fruit on the table, but actually the apple has a big hole in it because I don't remember the full apple, right? Nor the full jug, nor the full curtain, nor the full table. Nothing is full because they are just the outlines, and sort of more or less the shape is there, but there's big gaps, big lacunae of perception everywhere. So knowledge is incomplete. And because knowledge and memory are partially incomplete, so is thought, if it's based on memory, right? So there we have already part of the problem with thinking and knowledge, and therefore time, because this is part of it. They are limited, all of them. So thought is ever limited, and so we live in constant conflict and struggle. Why conflict and struggle? Sounds extreme, right? But you can see partly why that would be, because we don't meet anything completely. And life is challenge and response. And if we respond with this partiality, then we don't meet the whole thing. There's at least there is a, what do you call it? We don't meet it. That was have a Spanish language coming in my head. This encounter, you don't encounter fully what is happening there, like we said already, right? There is a limitation in it. The challenge, the response is not adequate to the challenge. And therefore, the challenge persists. Maybe there's conflict. If we don't meet a person or something, that is an issue there. There's contradiction. There's contradiction at least, right? Is struggle? Well, because why the struggle? Because we're still trying to have the need to overcome that difference. Because the challenge has not been met, the challenge remains. Is that maybe the nature of our problems? Why our problems psychologically persist? Because we don't meet them fully, and therefore they continue from day to day. I find that interesting and insightful, perhaps as a question to look further into. Is that maybe one of the causes? See, that the very partiality of thought and knowledge, time, is what allows our problems to continue. It's the problem, really, ultimately. If we could meet the challenge fully, that is not with thought only, if thought is part of it, but with some perception, direct and accurate, and then the action following from there, the problem will not persist. The problem is solved. The problem, there's a problem when the challenge is not met, right? And thought, if it is partial and cannot meet the challenge, then it's part of the problem. Is it? All right, hold the horses again. He says there is no psychological evolution. He just keeps throwing these things. This was his problem. Krishnamurti's no, it was not his problem. It was the problem of Krishnamurti's listeners, that he kept rapid, it was like rapid fire. And he kept bringing this tremendous total insights, boom, one after the other. And you couldn't see where did he pull? They're pulling like rabbits out of a hat. That seemed to be the nature of his mind. He had this quality of very quick perception. And he said, oh, I see this, I see that, I see that. So he kept seeing things and throwing them out. And we say, hey, wait a minute, we are already far behind. You ran away from us. He used to say this, he used to complain. People used to complain to Kate. He says, you're always jumping ahead. What are you doing? He said, then catch up. So we had to see if we can catch up. Why is there no psychological evolution? Now, this is a major issue, major statement to make, right? That there's no evolution. Now we're all hopeful. Now we all know that evolution exists. At least science seems to have made it very clear, right? Good old Darwin and good old Wallace, they came up with this thing of saying, no, there's evolution. This is there. Life, biology, it has moved, you see. It was not those in 7 days, everything was made and so on. That's a beautiful metaphor, but actually there was this one cell, somehow that happened there, and then they evolved. And it took millions of years before this monkey started doing mathematics. So voila, there you are. And you say, well, yes, this has been demonstrated. There's no going around it. But that became then a metaphor for everything that we are doing in relation to ourselves. That just like biologically, there's been an evolution, there's also an inner spiritual evolution as well. In fact, if you like, this has been a kind of, is a perception of history. You can say, well, right, culturally, it seems like we have a potential similar movement in place, right? That from the earlier primitive ways of conceiving of the world, and okay, the word primitive, I don't mean to put anything down, but this is how we tend to think about it: primitive, non-sophisticated, superstitious. Then he moves, the civilization moves, gets to be more objective, gets to be, less superstitious, right? And gets to understand things more. What I was saying earlier, the kind of the ascent of man through knowledge, through culture, through civilization, that we are improving. We always want to hear that, right? We are improving. We were barbarians yesterday, but today there's less violence. Is there? Maybe there's less, but there's more effective. We can do more with less. So is there less violence? Are we really evolving? And Krishnamurti says, psychologically, we are not. We're evolving technologically, and we have put a lot of faith in that in terms of changing humanity by creating right environments and so on. But the outer environment, it seems, does not change the inner man. Only slightly makes for a certain civilized ways, but you scratch that good old pleasant cat in this pleasant living room, and the cat comes out with the old claws. So that our violence is still there, our prejudices are still there, we are still psychologically not moved beyond that self-centered structure. And what he's suggesting here, I think, is that there's no moving away. The self cannot really overcome itself. Self-improvement is only improvement of the same selfish movement. Is it? That the self can only improve itself. I can only become more sophisticated in my selfishness. Therefore, that quality, if that is what evolution means, then that is not evolution at all, because the self is still the same old destructive, self-centered movement. Now more sophisticated than it used to be, but it's still the same old animal. So that's part of the question. See, is there not? Are we not putting our faith in something like this, that I will improve? I will better myself. But can the self be improved? Or does improvement, that change, comes from understanding the self and putting it away, transcending the limitation? Essentially what we're setting here is unless we move beyond the limitation, because the self is this movement of thought and time, huh? So no, don't forget. So it is bound itself by that same limitation. It cannot overcome that limitation. As long as the self is part and parcel, is rooted in time. If there is another self, I don't know, but the self psychologically, as we know it, is rooted in thought and time. And thought and time being inherently limited, according to Kay, and we look into that, cannot overcome itself, can never go beyond this limitation. It has to end. The nature of time and thought is to be limited, and the self based on those is limited, and there is no evolution beyond that point. It must, therefore, he says goodbye to one of our most cherished hopes, no spiritual, no evolution. Now he said, when we look into thought, this is the second part, we discover this division between the thinker and the thought. So thought is not only limited, but internally it is also divided. It doesn't not only divide us from each other by creating these separate identities, and because of its internal limitation, is not able to meet the challenge of life, of relationship in particular, right? Of the images that we have that separate us, confine us to the past. But he says also internally, we do the same to ourselves. We look at ourselves also through images. The thinker, what is the thinker? Is like an entity that says, I am here and my thoughts are there. I think, I am not thought. So it's something separate from thought. Now, when he starts looking at, when we start looking at ourselves, this is the interesting part, I think. We start looking at ourselves, what is looking at what? Is this, if this observer different from the observed? Okay? So he says, when man becomes aware of the movement of his own thoughts, he will see the division between the thinker and thought, the division between the observer and the observed, and the experiencer and the experience. So those are different ways of describing the same process, whereby there's an entity which seems to be acting, observing on an object. Now, psychologically, when we look at each other, who's looking? What's looking? So he says, the observer is the image I have of you. Me is just my images. What I remember, what I have built, the image I built of you over time and experience. Also, my image of myself is that same image, the same process. I have built an image of myself through time, and that is what looks. Now, when an image looks, how can an image look? If I look at someone with an image, it means that I'm projecting that on them. Isn't it? It's a projection. Now, if there is a projection and I see that as the other person, not realizing that it is a projection, then I am making a big mistake. I'm deceiving myself in terms of what I see. What I see is not them, or it may be part at best. What I see is my projection, is my memory, which is already twisted by my own interests, by my own ideas, by my memories. So again, the limitation of memory comes in. And on top of that, I don't realize the trick I'm playing on myself, that I'm not seeing the other, but I'm seeing the projection. When I see that it is a projection, then that can end. If I really care to see, if I really realize the danger of that projection, of not seeing, the danger of not seeing, then I have to question this whole process and be very attentive, because I am therefore making a mistake. This is the fundamental mistakes we're making in daily life. When we look at each other with the past, what we see is not the other. What we see is what we know. What we look, like Krishnamurti used to say, with the eyes of yesterday. But the eyes of yesterday only see yesterday. They don't see today. They don't see now. So that's part of the problem. The collapsing, therefore, the perception of an insight, the perception of this being the case, that I'm projecting and seeing only projection, is very important. That's what he means partly to say that the observer is the observed. The observer is an image which says, I recognize that other image, which has projected. They're both images, and therefore the same thing, same process, but we play this game with ourselves, of the observer being different from the observed. And that not only happens outwardly, that is, I cannot know you, in the sense of I cannot see you, but I cannot see myself, which is even worse. In some regards, I do the same to me. I also recognize myself, look at myself with the same division and image making. So we miss the actuality, both of the outer and of the inner. This is a very important question. According to Kay, here lies, if you like, the fundamental cause of division and the misery that we perpetuate in our relationships, as well as internally in the conflict with ourselves. So that's a very important thing to look into together. He will discover that this division is an illusion. Well, do we discover it? He will, right, you say no. That's right, we don't discover it, or seldom, occasionally, maybe. Luckily, we saw something when we were talking to someone and we found ourselves reacting, right? I remember this thing. One time I was working for the Krishnamurti Foundation for Latin America, and somebody was making very critical comments about this organization and its members. And I was getting angry like crazy. So you see, the Krishnamurti world is full of all these troubles as well. So don't idealize anything. We are just the same old monkeys at work. So I caught myself. I realized, I'm just identified with that thing. But what is the Latin American Foundation to me? And what am I to it? And what do I know about these people? Maybe this person is right. He's saying something I don't know. So it was the identification with that organization that made me feel the attack as a personal matter. So that ended that conflict. And I was able to listen to this person to the end. And I don't remember even anymore what it was said, because nothing registered. I was not the object or the target of the thing. So sometimes one can see that. And even internally, one has a problem. Sometimes it just happens that the division between the observer and the observed ceases. And there is therefore something else coming in. In fact, I think Krishnamurti is right that when the division between the observer and the observed ceases, there is insight. Why there is insight? Because there is no longer any impediment to direct perception of what is there. So we can discuss that, but generally we don't see that. We don't have, he also puts it as there's a total insight into the nature of the self, and he wipes it away forever. I'm not sure any of us is in that position. So we have to be humble enough to say, this is what he says, and we take it that this is the wisdom of the man, but he did it, and therefore he was free, but we are not. So we're trying to learn about it and see how we can grasp, get a hold of this whole structure, because it's a process. It's happening actually in daily life, the way we live, and it's a matter of being able to see it as it's happening. How am I projecting on everything and everyone all these images? How am I also an image? And how all these images are preventing seeing and are creating all these divisions? This is where what is about. So we'll hold that. You will discover it's an illusion. Well, you can see why he would say it, but we don't see it, like we said, right? So hold that. We haven't discovered it yet, only occasionally in certain particular situations, but not as a whole, to be free from the whole process. That's where it's at, ultimately, for him. Not just the occasional perception, which is helpful because it already gives us a hint that he's right about it being an illusion. It's an illusion because what I see is not factual. Right? It's an illusion that way. But hey, the actuality of our lives is where we have to look and be honest with ourselves. Then only is there pure observation, which is insight. There you are, without any shadow of the past or of time. That makes sense in terms of the whole logic of what it means to perceive. And when the observer is an impediment to perception because of these projections, what we see is not the actual thing, is the projection that we make on it. And we take it to be an independently existing reality, where it is just us seeing our own selves and not understanding that that is what we are. When that disappears, that delusion collapses. The delusion, then there is insight, there is perception at least, right? This timeless insight brings about a deep radical mutation in the mind. Well, you can see how even he would say that. He hasn't brought it to for us yet, right? So we are not there yet. But you can see why he would do it, because our minds at the moment are just conditioned to this structure. And this is how the mind is made up. The whole brain is now conditioned to operate in this manner. If that is not there, then you will operate differently. If it is a mutation, I don't know, but it will certainly be a transformative, fundamental change. So voila, there's a major issue here that we can go into together a little bit, hopefully. Alrighty.
Well, you've got me stirred up, I must say. And just in the last little bit that you were saying about illusion makes me try to see if I could see this illusion in front of me. Here I am looking down at my part of my desk here. And you could say this is a projection. Now I'm trying to look at it, what I'm seeing, the various objects in front of me and around me. I'm trying to see them. And we could say that I'm projecting, but I'm trying to see something. And there are little changes taking place. It's with this question in mind, what is this? Is this seeing, or is this just illusion? Anyway.
We see, yeah, it's a question. So if we look, can we see illusion?
But what is illusion? Like, just the thought or the image in the mind of the mirage on the desert, the classic idea. You see something wonderful, but it's just a mirage. But you see something wispy, perhaps, and it's an illusion. So, I mean, this whole issue you've been bringing up, so I would say dramatically, is extremely energizing in a very deeper way. I do have one question, though. You said something about evolution. Now, and two questions. I gather, I assume, I suspect that Krishnamurti knew of Ramana Maharshi, whose idea was, who am I? So that was Ramana Maharshi. I don't know whether he ever spoke about him or discussed anything. There was, who am I? That's all he said. And the other thing was the idea of evolution, and the evolution as the evolution of consciousness. So those two things are going sort of in tandem with this other issue of seeing and illusion.
Well, this is what questions, right? Questions whether there is, well, consciousness as the psyche, right? He says there is progress technologically, and there is evolution biologically. So there, things are moving. But he says psychologically, and we have to look what that means. We got stuck. mankind seems to have created a field in the psyche, what we call consciousness, leaving aside for the moment the whole technological side. So psychological consciousness, says there we got stuck. There's a sense in which we have created a field which, as a matter of fact, cannot progress, cannot evolve. It can only experience a change. And the change is to see that it is fundamentally based on the illusory misperceptions. We have misconceived our own nature. Those are my words. We have seemed to misperceive our own nature, psychologically speaking. Is that true? It's a big thing to say, no? That mankind has been deceiving itself. That's the implication. If this is the structure of consciousness that humanity has built for itself over the ages, and that it is fundamentally based on an illusory process, then we are stuck. Then we have made a major mistake. You see, this is what Krishnamurti, talking with Bohm, if you recall, in the whole series of The Ending of Time, he begins also fairly dramatically. I have a taste for the dramatic, so I like that kind of stuff. But he sort of says, I have the feeling that mankind long ago took a wrong turn. But that wrong turn continues to be taken. Otherwise, we might just turn in another direction, right? And go to, well, forget it. Our ancestors did this, and we move in a different direction. But it seems that the structure has stuck with us, and we continue to make the same mistake. And as far as I could tell, and I haven't investigated it deeply enough, the implication of that diagnosis of Krishnamurti concerning the overall human condition and the condition of suffering in which we are, is that we made the wrong turn consisted in putting our being in time. That it is based upon memory, and that is a fundamental mistake, that being is not of time. So there's been, according to him, a fundamental misunderstanding. And the seeking of completeness, of wholeness, within that field is an impossible mission. Mission impossible. Because time cannot transcend itself. Because it's bound to the past, and the past is inherently has a border, a limitation, cannot move beyond itself. Is that the case, or these are just words that sound somewhat plausible? You see how subtle it gets, because it has cosmic implications. It has implications regarding the very fate of humanity. It's not a simple philosophical issue. It has to do with a fundamental diagnosis concerning the tragic nature of human existence, indeed. See? No wonder it's dramatic, because that's the implication. He says, as long as we exist within this fixed, stagnant movement, we cannot meet life, and that will be our undoing. So there's a big thing there. I mean, I wish I could be more subtle about it. I have to go further into that thing. It was an important issue to consider. But that's what he's talking about. He's saying, look, this has implications, and deeper implications for the whole of mankind. And in fact, now that we are masters of the planet, for the whole of life in this planet, is a huge responsibility, therefore, to find out whether this is true. To find out what is true about what is the essence, the root of our fundamental malaise and our destructive tendencies. Is he right or not right? Maybe he's not right, but it doesn't matter. If he's not right, we have to keep on going, figure it out. Is the challenge that we have with ourselves, right? To put an end, if we can, we are aware of the implications of what we are, put an end to this destructive tendency. And he says, as far as he's concerned, there is where it lies, according to his own diagnosis. Just to put it more dramatically than before.
So if I was going to be the devil's advocate and speak on behalf of the psychological self, I would say that I get a lot of benefits from, if I can figure out how to avoid pain, to me, that's a good benefit. If I can figure out how to repeat my pleasures, even pleasures like aggression being pleasurable, then, it's a good system. It's self-protection, and it seems to work for me. If I can figure out how to make more money than the next guy or whatever, and buy a bigger house or go on vacations or workshops or whatever I like to do with my money, all of that stuff, it's, a lot of people are going to listen to this and say, well, why is it a problem? I'm quite happy. I've got a good deal going here, and I know how to avoid pain that I've had in the past, and I can get the stuff I want. And, what's the big issue, right? So, and from the inside, from the point of view of the self, it can seem very reasonable, really, to carry on this way. It doesn't, I might have a wisp of the fact that my behavior is affecting other people, but then I can say, well, it doesn't really matter that much. I'm not hurting them that much, so on and so forth. So really, what's the deal?
That's right. That's right. We can always find ways to say, okay, there is just what do you call it? A modicum of comfort that is necessary. And as long as I can manage to do that, I'm okay. As long as I'm okay, I'm always okay. So there is no perception beyond that field. So that is part of it. And it's difficult enough, isn't it, to keep a roof over your head and so on, depending on where you are, of course, and what you do with everything. So this is part of our outlook, isn't it? That we say, okay, I have to do the best for myself. And as long as that is sort of in order in terms of creates the right environment of security and the little pleasure that satisfies me and the little image that is also satisfied, that whole thing. And I am in a society that is more or less, orderly and so on and so forth. I do my job, I pay my taxes, and I have my little pleasure. It's okay, I behave myself overall. But wait a minute, that's the problem with human consciousness. I'm not an insect living in a little corner of the world, just trying to fend for myself within that little piece of terrain. The problem with consciousness is that we are aware of the overall phenomenon of human existence. And if we are at all aware, and that's just the issue, if we are at all aware, then we see how we are participating inherently in everything that is happening. That the big violence carried out somewhere else is my little violence carried out in my home. That's the problem. See, if I am at all sensitive, then I cannot separate me from the world at all. And also I cannot separate myself from all the people who have already been in the world. It's just not a matter of my generation or another generation, but of the awareness of all the generations that have been and how they too struggled and suffered, destroyed, and cried their hearts out for what they could not resolve. That mankind, this is my view, bring out yourself again to counter it. And the devil's arguments are good always to have in place. But the sense I have is that we are that humanity which has not understood itself and has created for itself untold suffering generation after generation. If I am aware of that, and I'm aware of the fact that in me, that lives on, that me is that, then I cannot escape the question. I can't just settle easily for my little comforts. at least if I do, because I say I can only act within this little thing, I cannot stop the war in Ukraine, I can do this, but I can stop war in principle if I understand my violence. So there is that beautiful implication of consciousness. It can be uncomfortable because it won't let me rest, won't let me create this bubble that we all want, a bubble of security for myself. And as long as I'm okay, that's all right, right? It's like the hobbits in the Lord of the Rings. They said, I hear these rumors of all these people happening and all these things going on. Let all these people, as long as they don't trouble us, we're okay. Who's got growing the bigger pumpkin? So you see, but it turns out that there's no way of separating the Shire from Middle Earth and from Mordor. It's all going on at the same time, and it's all created by us and the way of our thinking and our delusional notions of ourselves, where we seek our being, our importance, our search for immortality, our wanting to remain in history and being somebody. A whole thing has to be looked at. So there you are. See, I also would like to have just a little piece of cake in the evenings and not bother about anything. Unfortunately, sensitivity, the awareness of what I am and what the world is, won't let me rest so easily. I still eat my piece of cake, and I eat it gratefully because it could be worse, right? I know people are in much difficult. They don't have cake and they don't have even a place, a roof over their heads. So I feel for that, see? So I'm grateful, but at the same time, the awareness won't let me rest because I know this is a big stream. It's not just me, it's the whole of mankind, and it's human consciousness, which is in trouble with itself. That's my sense, you see? So we can shut it off. We can avoid that. The thing is, what's that has to do with me? We can, but it doesn't take much to show that it has to do with every single me that exists in the world. It doesn't take much.
You.
Tom, you wanted to say something earlier.
Oh, I was trying to, it gets confusing to me when you think about thought and the thinker, but a way of rephrasing it for me to make more sense or made it more accessible is to say that we have a process of objectifying things, of creating objects. And the problem is we use the same process that creates objects to evaluate or look at the process. And it doesn't work because it's a limited, that process is, it seems inherently limited, but that's what we know. And so we try to use that to think our way out of thought. And I think that, and because we don't realize we're doing that, and I think that means, the thinker is the thought. We're trying to use thought to think our way out of thought. It's a trap. And we just try harder. The definition of insanity doesn't work. Just keep doing the same thing harder and harder. And I think we're insane because the part of the insanity of us is we try to use thought to cure ourselves of thought instead of just going, whoa, wait, we got to pause here. Anyway, that's what made sense to me.
I would try to cure thought by thought. See, we have done a lot of thinking, right, about this. Humanity has done a lot of thinking about itself. Some of it quite lucid, but we have not come out of it.
No.
I just took a look the other day because I was looking at David Bohm's life and so on, and he was very interested in Hegel. So I just took a look at Hegel. My God, that guy must have had an incredible brain with an incredible capacity to handle abstractions. And some of it was extremely lucid, subtle as it is. I mean, it's a high level of abstraction that he's handling, but he's also trying to solve the whole human issue and how to look at the human consciousness and how it's moving through time, through these contradictions and so on. Impressive stuff. Hey, but we are still in it. So what is actually necessary? Maybe equality of questioning is still necessary Thought may have a part to play, but actually what is the key, according to Kay, is perception. We have to look into perception more than have the reflection of thought. The reflection of thought may go a certain ways, right? Right now we're verbally communicating with each other at that level. So it may have a certain objectivity even, because we have drawn on certain facts, and we can see that logically things can hold together. But logic goes only so far. The fact of the matter is that we still have to have an insight. Insight is the real key to all this, right? To perceive the actuality of thought, how it's operating on a daily basis from this ground of memory, how it's splitting itself in perception, projection, and then the perceiver of that projection, how we deceive ourselves that way, and therefore create the chaos in which we're caught. That is just a description. So is there a perception, you see? Can we go at that perception in our daily lives? It was very interesting while preparing for today to just consider for a moment in terms of what Kay was saying, whether it's at all possible. Actually, he put the question right before me, right? Because I sometimes maybe we don't consider some of the practicalities that may be possible on a practical basis, which is to perceive without time. And he says, well, just take a simple example. To perceive without time means you look at your wife without the remembrance of her. And you look at yourself without the notion of yourself, your self-image. And also you look at her without your self-image. So you take time out of the field of perception. Is that possible? I suddenly felt, there may be something that we could experiment with here. I mean, it had not occurred to me really to say, can it even be because he always takes, don't do anything deliberate. This has to be through perception, not something that you sort of set out to do. But I say, well, I'm not sure about that. Maybe you can be a bit more experimental and say, all right, I'm aware that I'm now looking at my wife with the image. Yesterday, she called me a fool, and I remember that now, and I'm still feeling resentful about that insult. Can I be aware of that and remove it? Or by seeing it, it removes itself because it's standing in between. And my intent is to see my wife, is to relate to her, is to not let anything come between us. Right? So is that not possible, maybe? I said to myself, wait a minute, there may be actually a very practical suggestion here for all of us, abstract as the whole discourse sounds, that it has to do with the awareness of how these images, these projections are working in a day-to-day basis. The ending of time is not something ultimate, it's something immediate that has to do with this very process. That is, I think, as simple as I could see it, no? And therefore, that it is not impractical, and it's not mystical, and it's not ultimate, and it's not total. It's just the simplicity, perhaps, of the day-to-day operation of one's consciousness, the way one sees, feels, acts, from where. So that I thought that was very nice, because I said, oh, I like the fact that it sort of doesn't put it away, again, in some abstract domain that is to be reached, but that bringing it closer to the day-to-day life, so that I am becoming, what is calling me to do is to awaken to how I am, see, in daily life. That is much nicer. And therefore, seeing the danger of time and removing it.
Yeah, wouldn't that pertain to awakening to this moment, actually? And along with the question, for instance, my wife is not in the room right now, so I can't do that with her. But the question of perception is sort of, I would almost say, staring me in the face with great interest. So, again, you warn against abstraction. So I want to perceive what exists. I think that's what everybody is inclined toward. No one wants to spend the rest of his life being in self-deception.
That is our intent. See, if we are at all aware of the danger of this whole process that we're describing, that one makes those mistakes on a daily basis, is responding to the present with the past, and therefore, creating the same old division. We have moved on. We don't allow ourselves to move on.
What you were just saying, though, a little while ago about the simplicity of the moment and being aware of the image that you have about, oh, I see what I'm doing with my image of my wife. Okay, let that drop, let go. It's like, that's like a big deal, what you were just talking about. It's like a really small thing, but I mean, yesterday I was working with a young woman and she was talking through these different thought things that were getting in her way. And it was like, if only she could just see herself through my eyes. If she could just, I mean, someone said the job of a therapist is to love in a strange sort of way, to love your client until they're able to love themselves. And I thought that's like really profound.
Yes, because you're not judging them at all.
No.
This is the part, and this. Therefore, we're talking about doing some therapy in our lives.
Yeah.
Therapy just means healing, right?
Yes.
Is the meaning of the Greek word, right? So we're talking about healing ourselves, if we can, through this awareness of the factors that fragment us, which constitute our sickness, right? Overall. So there you are. See, if we can see ourselves without that fragmentation, right? Without that separation, see ourselves without judgment and so on clearly, then we have the beginning of healing.
Mala had her hand up earlier.
It's also kind of a problem that,
Sorry?
I don't know. Oh, okay. It's also kind of a problem that somehow the image is not just in me. The image is also about me, around me, by everyone else. I have a certain position, I have a certain work, I have a certain whatever role in front of my children and whoever, whatever. And sort of that is also, that makes it very hard to sort of step out of it somehow, because everybody knows who I am and what I am and what I own and where I live and how I react normally. And it's spread around somehow. The consciousness is big. The image is big.
Yes, and we are kept also, our images are sustained by the reflection of the environment.
Yeah.
Somehow, sometimes I do think that our social existence is, the images rather, have a lot of power in terms of our social existence. We value each other according to the standard values of the society. And therefore, we place ourselves within that society according to those values, which are images, which are whether we fit or don't fit the image. And once the image is settled, it's very hard to move out of it. The image has already a static nature to it. Tends to fixation, tends to be a kind of conclusion. Right? So in families, for example, that tends to happen, right? That we fall into a series of roles and a series of patterns, and everybody knows everybody, and therefore it seldom, if ever, moves, shifts. So there's the aggressive parent, the kind parent, the miscreant child, the good child, everything fits into some pattern, and then it almost can't move. But you can see that when that's happening, the love that Tom was talking about kind of goes out the window, because we begin to act mechanically in relation to each other. We don't even give each other the opportunity to change, because my very projection upon you will be from the past, and I will try to keep you there. This is really odd, isn't it? That we, even in relationship, because of the conclusion from before, we tend to fix each other in yesterday. We bring each other back continuously to what we had been. That's the reference, the referent. We don't suspend it and begin anew each day. Put the past behind us, or not even behind, out of the picture. That would be beautiful, no? If we could, I mean, whatever relevant past is there, that's all right. But look what freedom it would give us. You see, the freedom is there somewhere, isn't there? That's why love is freedom, because it's part of that seeing that takes you as you change and as you are in that movement. And I also change and move and don't get stuck. And we can learn together through thick and thin, we move. The movement, giving life is creative opportunity. Instead of shutting it down by a continuous reference to the past, which is what happens in our relationships, see? I did find that also, even as a kid. The moment people fix me in an image, I couldn't budge. It's like I couldn't be myself because I was all kinds of things, right? But they said, no, you are that. What are you doing? You're not yourself. Well, who's to say, right? So there is a fixation, and society does that also. Culturally, already, that's also an image. You can see what's happening in the world. The moment people do something else, even if they remove their headscarf, boom, they get the full brunt of the society against them. It's a stupid thing. But you see how power is there in relation to the image. It's just a purely imaginative construct that has been given tremendous power and authority and is destructive.
Aren't we putting the past behind us in this group right now? Isn't that what this group is really engaged in? We don't want to be controlled by the past, so it's kind of almost a sense of agreement that we don't want to be ruled by the past. We want to be here now. This group particularly, that's what we're talking about. That's the impression I get.
Well, we're trying to learn how the past is present.
Well, we already know that's been clarified. That the past is misleading us. So we recognize a truth in this. So we're being present now. We're not being affected by the past, at least in these few moments that this group is convening and working together. That's the way it's striking me.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Well, I mean, the difficulty is that there's ever deepening kinds of subtlety involved. So you can be aware of certain processes going on, and there's all sorts of things that you're not aware of. So this thing of setting aside the past first, I mean, it has to be seen as the past in order for it to die or be set aside or whatever, right? So, but I mean, that's the whole thing of him, he always says, start where you are. The longest journey begins with the first step. So you take what you have on your plate now and see what you can see with that. And then, it evolves on its own. So I'm just responding, David. I'm not trying to, set it aside or whatever what you said, but it's with the proviso that the past is perceived at a certain level at a given time. That's all. And other times it's not perceived at all. It just seems natural or normal or part of the flow of things or whatever words you want to put to it. So I just wanted to bring that in.
Yeah.
We have only a few minutes, so we have only a few minutes. So I wanted to invite people who have not said anything, if they want to say something. This would be a good time.
Well, I feel a bit uneasy about Mala having had her hand up for a while and not being able to then say anything. So what, do you still want to share something, Mala?
I'll share the question that came up for me at the time, because I just jotted it down. But when you said, Javier, the words of, the awareness of what I am won't let me rest. There was so much energy behind that reached out to me, like, that the awareness of what I am won't let me rest, and how that's connected to a current societal issue of fatigue, and how to take, how to pace yourself around these things, because it's so, it's a journey of oneself in relation with others. And so there's this kind of movement in time that is not jiving with other people while you're trying to figure things out. So anyway, my question just came up, and then I sort of answered it myself and went back into listening and just appreciating listening to the rest of. I'm happy. Thank you for bugging Ralph, and I'm appreciating I got the question in, and I loved all the talk, even though I didn't get it in at that time. Thank you.
Thank you. That's the best way, you see, when the question answers itself.
It's good for you. It's good for
Yeah,
you.
quite right. Quite right. I was speaking
Yeah.
self-interestedly. Then I don't have anything to do.
But
Thank
it's
you very
good
much.
for me that I get excited that I answered my own question, actually. So I can feel the joy that comes in.
Yes, that's the
and the
best.
sort of frustration that kind of does transform itself into joy somehow in
Quite
doing
right.
it myself. So thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Nora, you wanted to say something earlier.
Well, I'm wondering about what it is that prevents us from really deeply having any insight into, the thinker and the thought and the separation there. Because in a way, you can sort of almost see, well, if I'm looking at myself, yes, it's anger, looking at anger or whatever it is at the moment, but it doesn't really, it seems to be some deep blockage. And what comes to my mind is, as Krishnamurti says, that the thought separates the thinker out. It gives it a permanence. And I feel it has to do with this sense of permanence. I mean, we are the past. We don't really want to be, we're attached to that. It must have to do with attachment as well. And I mean, this sense that there is nothing permanent to us. We crave that kind of permanence. And so it has to do, I think, really with death. It's a death of a self in some real fundamental sense, which maybe is quite fearful and terrifying. I don't know. But clearly there's a huge blockage. I mean, human beings have been told selfishness is the problem for centuries, right? But we don't seem to be able to, I mean, we can in moments, right? But
Right.
Yes, yeah.
This is no, but I think you're expressing something true and clear, right? Which is there is a great resistance to perceiving that this is impermanent. For example, we crave permanence. There's a certain very strong force in us in that direction. And therefore, we want to continue in the same way that the consciousness has structured itself. It's a kind of search for immortality.
Yes, we don't want to die. I can't even give up my attachments practically to. I mean, like it's difficult, right?
Exactly.
What gives us the power to give up attachment?
Exactly. This is the human condition. We have this drive, and it's very powerful. Right. That's why Krishnamurti says you need to gather enormous energy. See, we don't seem to have the energy. But of course, that's a tricky thing. Look, he says this is an impossible question. Why did he call it impossible? Because there is no way that you can devise to achieve it. And yet it must be done. Because the diagnosis is clear also. And yet the energy, the drive is exactly like you said, is in this direction. I do not want to die. And therefore I hold on to whatever is me. That's what gives me permanence. And I seek that permanence within the continuity of me. But the me continues only as time, only as memory recognizing itself going forward. But the very fact that it is a memory is itself impermanent. But we don't see that. See, that's the major issue. The question of permanence, to perceive that there is nothing permanent to us psychologically. And that although a certain degree of continuity would seem to be necessary in order to survive, right, physically and so on. You think of tomorrow, you know, the squirrel gathers nuts. These days they're gathering nuts. So for the winter, right? So they're very busy. I respect them very much. And I know what that is. So I gather nuts too. So fine. But psychologically, what is me? How does that continue? Why is that so powerful? And it does have to do with that whole fundamental issue of life and death. We have not understood death. We can't embrace death. Somehow the whole psychological movement of humanity has set itself against it. It's something like that. See? Another cosmic little battle. We do not want to die. And that's the great fear. And therefore we go this way, accumulating things, gathering more to our identity, and therefore emphasizing the whole movement of thought and time. Indeed, indeed, look at it, how big that becomes. That's the history of mankind. Why are all these leaders doing the horrible things they're doing? Partly because they're seeking immortality. I see them as repeating the good old story of Gilgamesh in good old Mesopotamia, doing violent deeds in order to be remembered. They're seeking immortality in memory. It's horrible. They don't see the total contradiction of seeking immortality in memory, which is what we do. I mean, you raised a tremendous question, but that's it. You see, that's exactly right. There is this resistance. It's inbuilt in the very nature of the psyche and what it is pursuing, and what it is pursuing it through. Pursuing immortality by the way of time. That's what Kay denies also, right? But he can deny it. We can't, because we're still there. We're still in that movement, and we have to look into it. We have to see what it does, whether there's truth to it. And we can't otherwise. We're stuck with it. So yes, that's our condition. And that's the drive, the search for immortality that the psyche has created for itself in this direction. Kay says there is immortality, but is not here, is not within the field of thought and time. Immortality is that which doesn't die because it's alive itself, it's part of creation. It dies and is born at one and the same time. The beginning and the end are one and the same. Therefore, there's no time in it. There's no gap between beginning and end. This is what we think immortality is a movement towards an end, and the endless continuity of that. He says, no, immortality is this continuity of time. So there we have to look further, to see, is there something to that? Is immortality the deathless when the one time dies? That's why he calls for death as a fundamental healing process psychologically. The dying of the false is the birth of the true. And only the true is immortal. And the true is always new. That's why he's always saying, careful, because unless the past ends, you won't be able to see anything new. And the new is the true, because truth is creation, and creation has no continuity, is forever being unknown. The beginning and the end are one and the same, simultaneously. Death and life going hand in hand into the infinite. If I could make an image. This is just poetry, but we have to really, this is part, you see, look what our life involves, huh? Look what every single one of us is involved in this very cosmic inquiry. These are cosmic, fundamental, universal issues. That's part of what we're trying to do, to raise our awareness of the universality of what we're dealing with and the difficulty. So if we find this simple thing, like we were talking with Tom, right, about this perception of the image and the ending of it, we may have, according to Kay, a beginning of discovering what timeless living is. And then we can see, maybe discover whether there is death or not death in that movement. And if there is death, whether that's not also part of life, part of creation, in terms of that ending of continuity of me and time. Huh? Sounds mythical, but it's real. It's in our daily lives. Huh? Sounds mythical. I mentioned Gilgamesh, but each of us is in that same process in bigger or smaller ways. It is inherent to human consciousness, that challenge. Okay.
So thank you, everyone, for participating in this, I think, particularly important theme and meeting. So, and especially thank you, our facilitator, Javier, for being willing to tackle these big questions. And
it is difficult, but you can see that it's beautiful to do it together, huh? Because it is our lives, and look how much is in our normal everyday life, how much is there actually, huh? Of this total dimension of our own being and the implications of it. That's what I find beautiful of doing this sort of thing.
Yeah, it has to have meaning in our own lives somehow, all this. And that's our challenge for each one of us. And these meetings hopefully provide some incentive to explore further in our own way, in our own life.
Yeah, thanks all of you. Yeah.
See you next time. Perhaps, hopefully.
Take care, you guys.
Yeah.
Take care.
Yeah.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.